Today's reading is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the ruler of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another way. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. You bow with me in a moment of prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. And let all God's people say, Amen. So I grew up in Bushton, Kansas, a town that was so small, everything was pretty close together. There were only a few hundred people in the entire town. And my family was all right there close together, too. One set of grandparents, my mom's parents, lived one block to the east of us, and my dad's parents, my grandma and grandpa Schwartzfeger, lived just a block to the north of us. So one afternoon when we were still really little, it was arranged for my brother Alan to walk up to Grandma Schwartzfeger's house all by himself, which was kind of a big thing. He spent some time there, and when it was time for them to walk home, Grandma called my mom just so that she would be on the lookout for him. Now, I need to paint the picture for you here, all right? You could stand in our front yard, and you could practically watch somebody walk out of Grandma's front door. That's how close all of this was. So a couple of minutes after Grandma called, my mom went to the window to look for Alan. Didn't see any sign of him yet. No big deal. She went back to what she was doing. Several minutes later, she went to the window to look for Alan again, and still no sign of my brother. And so she got on the phone, called Grandma, and asked, did Alan decide to stay a little longer or something? Grandma said, well, no, he left more than 10 minutes ago. Well, by then, it was all alarms. What had happened to Alan? Had somebody snatched him? Had he run away? Grandma came over to our house to sit with me while Mom got in the car and drove around to try to find my brother. And it was pretty exciting, frankly. Nothing this exciting usually happened in our town and in my family. And after at least a half hour, my mom came home, and you have to understand that in a half hour, you could not just drive, you could walk on every street in our hometown 2 or 3 times. And she had seen no sign of Alan, and right then, right at that moment, Alan just kind of strolled in the door like nothing was going on. Of course, we all ran over to him and hugged him and made sure he was all right. And then, naturally, my mom demanded to know, "Young man, where have you been?" To which Alan replied nonchalantly, "I took a shortcut." A shortcut. Yeah, well, my mom was not amused. And she ranted and raved, and she read him the riot act. And I still remember my grandma, bless her heart, she never, ever interfered in the way that my parents raised their kids. But in this one time, she reached out and she put her hand on my mom's shoulder And she said, well, he is okay, Otika. And after all, Grandma said, there's more than one way to get home. Huh? More than one way to get home. Truth is, there's got to be more than one way to get home, because sometimes between wherever you are and home, something gets in the way, doesn't it? Whether it's our soldiers and sailors that are serving thousands of miles from their family this Christmas with no way to get home, whether it's those immigrants who have left one home and have not yet been welcomed into another home, whether it's people who have felt disconnected from their church and are just wanting to feel at home in a faith community, and whether it's commuters who are trying to make their way through all of the road closings and orange barrels out there. There's got to be more than one way to get home. Here's the Bible story that we just heard. Those wise men, they came from afar. They traveled all the way from the Far East to Bethlehem in Judea, where Jesus the Messiah had been born. And they were interested in Jesus because they had seen his star, the one that rose at his birth, kind of the star that marked the birth of a king. And they followed that star by stages all the way. It showed them the place where Jesus had been born. But along the way, you remember, they stopped to talk to King Herod, who ruled all of Judea on behalf of Rome, one of those kind of evil, selfish rulers. And Herod had his own reasons for wanting to find the baby Jesus, because if he was a king, well, then he threatened Herod's place and position, right? He might knock Herod off his throne. And so Herod wanted Jesus found and put to death. And he tried to kind of secretly enlist the wise men in his evil conspiracy. But those wise men, after they had bowed down and worshiped the Christ child, after they had given him their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. And so, Matthew's story tells us, they left for their own country by another road. That is, they took one of my brother's shortcuts. They went home another way. There's always another way to get home. You know, here's one thing this story has always meant to me. It is easy to worship when you're in Bethlehem, right? I mean, who wouldn't bow down and worship when you're in the presence of the newborn King and Son of God? It's easy to give generous gifts. It's easy to see the light. It's easy to feel close to God when you're right there in Bethlehem. The trick is to take that with you when you go. The trick is to get home with all of that. The hard part is still being generous when you leave Bethlehem. The hard part is taking that light of Christ with you out into a troubled world. The trick is to still feel close to God when you return to the rough and tumble of your everyday life. That's the hard part, because it seems like so often between wherever you are and home, something gets in the way. And the Christmas story calls that something that gets in the way Herod. Herod is the name given to that evil that tries to pull you off the right course, that trouble that's always poking up its head in your life, that power that makes every step towards home hard and filled with doubt. But here's what the story says. King Herod set his evil trap for those visitors from the east, but they just went home another way. They got their own. They were wise men, after all. So here's the thing. When you have been with the Christ, when your life has been changed by the love of God, you got to take it with you. You got to get that home. Don't let anything stand in your way. There's always another way to get home. Now, historically, of course, King Herod has been dead and gone for how long? A couple thousand years, I suppose. And in some ways, he's still with us, isn't he? Just the names have changed. We don't find evil in the Roman Empire or the Judean aristocracy anymore. But the forces of violence and oppression and trouble are still with us, and they seem to come to some people's lives more than others. I still remember when I was pastor at Christ Church way out on the east side. We got a new member one time. I'll call her Pearl. Pearl's actually younger than I am, but she has been through 10 times more than I ever will be in my whole life. Pearl never had enough money to have a car, and so she just went to the church that was close enough to walk to, and that was our church, and she jumped in with both feet. She immediately became one of the cooks for our monthly community dinner. Pearl had a way of rounding up every kid in the community to bring them to Vacation Bible School. You know the sort of person I'm talking about. And, you know, her faith was just so vibrant and so excited when she first got to the church. But Herod kept popping up in Pearl's life. Pearl was raising her nephew because her sister, the boy's mother, had a crack addiction and was in prison at the time that I met them. And, you know, he'd seen a lot. He'd had a hard life. And so he made some really boneheaded decisions. And one day he was walking to school, and in the bushes along the sidewalk he saw a gun that somebody had tossed away. And instead of going and reporting it to the principal, he picked it up and he took it to school. And they had to expel him for 60 days. He lost a whole year of school over that. And it broke Pearl's heart, and it made her afraid for what would happen to him and what he might do. And right after that, she got sick. She had to have major abdominal surgery. And because she was poor and on Medicaid, she got second-rate medical care. She had to have a second surgery. That got infected, and she missed months of work over that. And she was the only one working to pay the rent in her family. And right after that, her dad, who was an alcoholic, got too sick to stay by himself anymore. He refused to go to a nursing home. The rest of the family kind of turned their backs. So guess what? He moved in with Pearl, and she had to take care of him every day. And the month after he moved in with her, her mom died. And then a month later, her dad died. And then she called me one time in the middle of the night at home, and she asked if her family and the neighbors could come and spend the rest of the night at the church, because there had been a drive-by shooting at their apartment complex, and the shooter had threatened to come back. And so the next week, Pearl moved her family to a different apartment complex, hoping to keep them safe. It really cost too much. She couldn't quite afford to live there. And then there was a drive-by shooting at that apartment complex 2 weeks later, and a little girl 2 doors down from Pearl was wounded in that shooting. And because she had missed so much work from the surgery, they got evicted. And they were just 2 days away. I was working with them to get them into the community shelter board system when a distant relative found out about their situation and offered to let them stay for a while in half a double way out on the west side. Well, you know, Pearl was excited to have a place to live, but in some ways I'd never seen her so dejected, because it was a 25 or 30-minute drive out there, and she didn't have a car. She didn't want to live that far away from her extended family. She certainly didn't want to be that far away from her church. And that far away, I just figured I would never see Pearl again in my life. But just a week or so later, the phone rang. It was Pearl. She wanted me to come out and see what she'd done with the new place. And when I walked up the sidewalk, she flung the door open, and she said, Pastor Glenn, look what I have done with this new place. This is my new home. And she wanted to show me 2 things above all. On the coffee table, front and center, was her Bible. And she'd already begun to put together a schedule of church members who had offered to come and pick her up on Sunday mornings and get her to church. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, because it's easy to have faith It's easy to pray and give thanks to God. It's easy to feel close to God when you're in Bethlehem, right? When everything's hunky-dory, when you've got gold, frankincense, and myrrh on hand. It's harder to take it with you, isn't it? It's harder to have that when you go home. But here's what Pearl did. Every time Herod laid one of his evil traps, she just went home another way. Seems like between wherever you are and home, there's always something in the way, isn't there? But don't let anything stop you. Don't let anything get in your way, my friends. There is always another way to get home. Now, the truth is, it doesn't take all that happened to Pearl. It doesn't take all that violence and tragedy to come between us and home. It takes much less than that, because for a lot of people nowadays, especially when it comes to church and religion, the old ways home just don't work anymore. Family life really is different. Some people don't understand this, but family life really is different nowadays than it was when I was a kid. Families are so busy and distracted and torn here and there, and it really is hard for families to find that 2 hours on Sunday morning for Sunday school and church, and another hour in the afternoon for youth group, and another hour on Wednesday night for Bible study. And people have been telling us in the church for years that committee meetings and church socials just don't do much for them anymore. And people have been voting with their feet by not coming to church for years. They're telling us that the same old church music and the same old lame sermons just don't get them home to God anymore. And so if people are going to get home to God, especially, let's be clear, especially if young people, our kids and our grandkids, if they're going to get home to God at all, they're going to have to get there some other way. Now, what might that way be? Well, maybe we need a new contemporary service. Maybe we don't need a service at all. Maybe we need to meet at homes around tables and have Bible study and prayer and song at home. Maybe, gosh, I don't know, maybe we need to worship in more languages than we're already worshiping in. I don't know the details. What I do know is this, that we've got to stop talking about creating new ways for people to get home to God. We got to start trying some things. We got to have more ways for people to get home to God, because there's always another way to get home. I want to say one more thing about this. Sometimes what comes between you and home is, well, you. You. Our foolish pride, our addictions and our desires, our reluctance to try new things, maybe most of all our fear and anxiety gets in the way between us and being at home with God. To paraphrase Pogo, remember he said, we have seen the enemy and he is us. We have seen King Herod and he is us. And people are their own worst enemies. You probably know people. There are people who build bigger and bigger houses in better and better zip codes, only to find out you can be just as miserable in a big house in the suburb as you were in a little apartment in the city. And there's people who are always looking for some new woman, some new man, somebody to help them feel loved, only to find out that feeling love has to come from the inside, from your heart. And of course, a lot of times we cut ourselves off from the people that we love and need the most, because I'm sorry is hard to say, and because forgiveness is hard to accept. If you're going to get home in this life, you got to do it some way other than those things. Home isn't so much about having more rooms or bigger rooms. It's about doing something meaningful in the rooms you've got. A sense of home comes from prayer and faith. A sense of home comes from trusting that God is with you wherever you are, whatever you've done, whatever has been done to you. And while home is certainly a place of refuge, It's a place to rest and to be restored. Home is always about making room for other people, especially for children and the aged, and I would say especially for strangers and for the poor. And so if you will open up your heart, if you will open up your home, and I mean that quite literally, if you will open up your life, you will certainly feel more at home in this world God has given us. So often it seems like between wherever you are and home, something gets in the way. Some evil tries to pull you off the right course. Trouble is always poking up its head. There's some power that makes every step towards home difficult and doubtful. We know that Herod is alive and well, don't we? And sometimes Herod is us. But here's the moral of the story. Here's the moral of the story. Whenever Herod lays his evil trap, here's what you do. Just go home some other way. There's always more than one way to get home. I believe it with all my heart. Home, finally, is the manger in Bethlehem where at midnight even oxen kneel. I believe it with all my heart that home, finally, is Christ. And so I invite you this Christmas to come home to Christ, to come and bow down before Him, to open up your treasure chest to Him. If you will give your life to Christ, it will never be the same again. But here's the thing. It's easy to worship in Bethlehem, isn't it? It's easy to feel close to God in Bethlehem. The trick is to take that with you out into the world. The trick is to get home with all of that. So one final word. When you leave here today, I mean that quite literally, when you go out into the parking lot and get in the car and turn that ignition over, whether you go straight home or take one of my brother's shortcuts, don't let anything get in your way. There is always more than one way to get home.